coming back to my YouTube page, guys. Thank you for your likes, comments, subscriptions. Okay, so today we're going to talk about the fourth interpreter role, or the advocacy, and when it's okay to advocacy. So if we repass from our previous classes 1, 2, and 3, we had a class about conduct or the message converter. The class number 2, it was about clarifier. We have adjunctive or additional class about cultural brokering. Then we had a class about clarifying in general. And now we are talking about these very rare cases, or 1% of the time, when it's necessary to advocacy. What advocacy mean in interpreter profession, and how we decide if we need to advocacy. Of course, the interpreter is not responsible for everything that is said in the conversation and how something is handled or if something is wrong. Advocacy is optional. I provide services as a freelance for other companies, and some of them absolutely forbid me to advocacy for each or whatsoever. They do not allow me to advocacy. So when I see that the things go wrong and I cannot advocacy for the person that I believe is in danger, I withdraw from the call and I render it or transfer it to more, I don't feel competent enough. I transfer it to another interpreter. And the companies that I provide services that are more tied with the national standards and California standards for interpretation, some of them, they do allow me to use advocacy as role in order to facilitate the communication. So if you guys are freelancers and you need to advocacy and you believe advocacy is something that will help you in the communication process, here in this video you're gonna find a few tips how to advocacy and when it's okay to advocacy in order to be safe and to stay within the boundary of your profession and feel that you did the right decision, that you did the right thing. As we know, advocacy is optional. If you want to stay in the boundaries of the interpreter role and you have to go to advocacy, which is the most invasive forms of intervention of the interpreter during the encounter, you have to make it in a transparent way or mode. How? Hello, madam, this is the interpreter speaking. Interpreter is advocating in the behalf of the patient and clarifying. Sometimes, and this happens a lot in my experience, sometimes the patient wants something. Let's say they want to enroll in a plan, but they don't know how to express it correctly. And if you interpret verbatim, the meaning get lost in the target language. But you can clarify, and if the provider does not understand, you can advocacy. When you can advocacy to explain or to clarify the person's desires or rights and make sure that the communication is efficient. So legally we have this opportunities to advocacy when is that first and number one, if we feel that the patient health, well-being, or constitutional rights are at risk. If we feel that patient health is at risk, if there is a discrimination, we have a right to advocacy. And we as an interpreter, we can do it as accurately as possible, we can withdraw, we can do that, but only if the individual health is in risk. If we see that the patient well-being, state, physical integrity, and so on, they are at risk. When the patient is at risk, we consider to advocacy. If there is a discrimination, if there is a fraud, if there could be something of huge misunderstanding, and in order to prevent the provider to do something on a banking account, on the health encounter, give a medicine, you can advocacy and remind the provider, clarifying the meaning. And when you intervene, go back again to the role of the conduct. Okay. But in order to advocacy efficiently, we have to consider some risks. If there is going to be any necessary changes that can be made to satisfy the patient needs, how many options the patient or the person have, who is capable of making these changes or coming with these positive outcomes when we solve problems. Is the patient aware of your intervening, and are they agreeing with your statements? So before we intervene, we have to make sure that we understand the primary meaning of the message. I'm giving an example. I was interpreting for someone. The patient said, I'm calling because my plan is not active. The provider responds, oh, you like to change your plan, is that right, sir? That was not what the patient meant. So interpreter, I intervene and I advocacy for him and say, no, madam, that's not correct. Interpreter is advocating for the patient. The patient like to reactivate their plan. So when you do that, you switch immediately the tones, you direct the meaning of the message, you help the provider to understand, and you protect the patient, right? But the interpreter must consider if what you do as advocacy is moral and in accordance with code of ethics and well-being of the patient. So the number one thing that the interpreter should think about when they want to advocacy for the patient, this is the well-being of the patient, right? Or the limited English speaking person, right? But there is some risk that the interpreter must consider before interacting as an advocate. What are the risks? Are you going to help to better meet the needs of the patients? If the answer is yes, it's okay to intervene, but you have to make sure that the patient is okay with that. You can receive a complaint from the healthcare provider. Trust me, guys, as an interpreter, in 10 years, I intervened only one time as an advocacy, and yes, I did receive a complaint. I did receive the complaint from the insurance company representative. Why? Because they didn't understand that I was just trying to render clear communication. If the interpreter receive a complaint for a customer or a customer of a company for which you provide freelance, this could affect your long-term relationship with the companies that you provide services for. So there could be negative consequences for the interpreter and for the patient if you don't consider all the risks and all the positive outcomes. So you gotta think of code of ethics and how this risk of advocacy could be justified legally in order to protect yourself as an interpreter. Remember, number one, serious harm or self-threatening or danger for someone or something. I'm talking about abuse, health harm, material like financial fraud and harm, or it could be racism and discrimination, violation of the human rights. This is when, as an interpreter, you can outcome an advocacy, right? The second thing, the second way or second situation when the interpreter can advocacy, this is when the content is misunderstood or misread. There is abuse or discrimination or something that is called power, position of abuse, power of abuse, and so on and so on. This is a legal term, but if you fear or see that there is serious misunderstanding that will bring to discrimination and abuse of power from the provider versus the patients, or from the representative not explaining well and discriminating the patient, then you have the right to advocacy, right? And another thing that you can do if you do not feel comfortable to interpret and intervene, especially if the provider is rude to you as an interpreter and you don't feel well as an interpreter in your role, you don't feel you're interpreting or rendering the message, you can withdraw apologizing and redirecting to another professional. But just remember, guys, before you start to advocacy, think about one question. Is that going to be beneficiary for the weak part, which normally is the person that doesn't speak the target language? If that's not beneficiary and you do not feel comfortable to continue some kind of harassment, you can politely withdraw. There is nothing wrong with saying, I'm sorry, I'm not feeling competent, I wish you a wonderful day. Okay, so when we advocacy, we are actively supporting taking an action outside of our interpreter boundaries in order to support the interest for problem solving solution or giving us problem solving intervention, to support, prevent harm, help to problem solve to the patient, or any kind of a negative outcome of this conversation. So the interpreter can advocacy to prevent harm, abuse, violence, discrimination, or any kind of a misunderstanding, guys. This is less than 1% of the time. I said to you, in 10 years, I advocacy once. That was everything from me. I hope that video helped you to understand how to better use advocacy in interpreting, especially in medical field. Thank you for being here and have a great day. Bye-bye.